At the center of all creation, there stands a sacred tree. From its roots spring the waters of life, and from its branches hang the fruit of life. When man was fresh sprung from the earth, he stood before this tree in the midst of God's sacred garden, naked, proud, and unashamed. Woman stood by man's side, and they were joined in flesh and spirit. Each was an image of physical perfection, God's best work. Beauty, nobility, and grace radiated from them, and where their bare feet tread, the earth rejoiced. They took freely of the fruits of God's garden, and lived in companionship with the animals, ruling mildly over them. They lived as one with the will of life, abiding by the laws of God, which he had set down in his creation. Theirs was a pure life and a true life. They lived with nothing concealed and nothing restrained. The unbridled expression of the will to life flowed through them, and they walked with God. There was only one condition for their carefree existence.
If you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be separated from the other animals and from me, and you will no longer be able to eat freely from the tree of life, for you will know death, and you will fear death, and death will haunt you all the days of your life, and follow you in the fields like a shadow.
Now the serpent was of all the animals the most clever and wise. The other animals relied on brotherhood for sustenance and protection, but the serpent had no companions. He went alone on his belly through the grass, and learned to make his means with trickery and deceit, and this had made him wise. And seeing him to be the wisest of all the animals, God appointed him to guard the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One day the serpent spoke to Eve as she tended the garden.
If you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, it will be a sin against God and nature, but you will be then as a god, knowing good and evil, and you will rule over all of nature, and your eyes will be opened.
And Eve, an innocent and honest animal, like helpless prey, was coiled in his clever words, and seeing the serpent wise, and enraptured by his glittering scales, she ate of the fruit, and Adam too ate. Now Adam and Eve knew good and evil, and their eyes were opened. The future stretched before them, an uncertain chasm. They knew pain, and they knew death, and time no longer seemed like an infinite stretch of days and nights. And God cast them out of the garden from which they sprung, saying,
Now the woman will be pained in childbirth, and cling unto her husband, and the man shall till the fields in the hot sun all the days of his life.
And they were separated from God, and from the animals, and from the pure expression of life. And no longer could they eat freely of the fruit of God's garden, for they knew evil and deceit. My source for this retelling was the King James translation of Genesis 1-3. In this video, we will examine this story from psychological, evolutionary, and symbolic perspectives in an attempt to abstract our new values in the context of modernity. But first, we must address the traditional Christian interpretation of Genesis. We reject the traditional Christian interpretation of Genesis as nihilistic because it views life itself as a catastrophe. It puts forth the valuation that death and suffering are mistakes, punishments. It renounces this world and the body as corrupted, sinful, and fundamentally unnatural. This interpretation stems from the Christian instinct for the renunciation of this world, for a better, idealized world, which is absent hardship. We reject the interpretation of the theft of knowledge as a sin or a moral evil. We also reject the interpretation that eating of the apple of knowledge was an act of lust. Nietzsche, who viewed the Christian worldview as nihilistic and anti-life, writes, "It was Christianity with its heartfelt resentment against life that first made something unclean of sexuality. It threw filth on the origin, on the essential fact of our life." We view sexuality as the drive to create life, not a sin against it. And we strongly reject the association of sin, suffering, and death with the body. In fact, we reject any moral interpretation of this story and understand it instead as descriptive. On the most basic level, Genesis 1 through 3 is a description of man's coming to consciousness and subsequent loss of the paradisal animal state of existence. In Eden, man lived in union with nature and God. Man was beyond good and evil, living that noble, unashamed, instinctual life of animals. The expression of his instincts was pure, without resentment, deceit, or shame. Man was not capable of evil in the same way that a lion is not capable of evil. But the acquisition of higher consciousness turned man against nature and against the animal in himself, against his own instincts. After eating of the fruit of knowledge, man becomes acutely aware of pain, death, and suffering. He is able to place the framework of good and evil over the amoral reality of nature. Death and suffering are evil, he says. With his increased self-awareness, man becomes ridden with guilt and shame, no longer able to express his instincts with the purity of an animal. He becomes ashamed of his instincts and learns to hide himself from nature, from God. Where he once followed the will of nature without hesitation or self-reflection, he now learns deceit, concealment, and disobedience. Nietzsche writes, "We no longer trace the origin of the human being in spirit, in divinity. We have placed it back among the animals, and even in asserting that, we assert too much. The human being is, relatively speaking, the most bungled of all the animals, the sickliest, the most dangerously strayed from its instincts. But for all that, he is of course the most interesting." With the acquisition of higher consciousness, man becomes wise, but also wicked and deceitful. He acquires the worst sickness, dissatisfaction with life, resentment against being, and shame at his own existence. After the fall, man begins to turn against his own nature, which he is ashamed of and seeks to restrain. Thus, the process of the domestication, the weakening and sickening of man begins, a process which has been dramatically accelerated by the innovations of industrial society. Nietzsche writes, "To call the taming of an animal its improvement is in our ears almost a joke. Whoever knows what goes on in menageries is doubtful whether the beasts in them are improved. They are weakened, they are made less harmful, they become sickly beasts. It is no different with the tamed human being." Nietzsche renounced Christianity because it seeks to further the taming of man and the subversion of his nature. Yet here we find ourselves in agreement with the Christian interpretation that a return to Eden is in fact desired. Nietzsche called such a return the reanimalization of man. Man's fall from the animal state, though a necessary trade-off for the advantages which higher consciousness provides, was a tragedy and a rebellion against God and nature which introduced sin, that is, shame and guilt, into the world. Nietzsche writes, "Error has transformed animals into men. Is truth perhaps capable of changing man back into an animal? Nietzsche believed that the reanimalization of man was a necessary counterforce to the degenerative forces of modernity. Mankind, which, since the fall, has lived in an anti-natural state, must now aspire to acquire again the nobility, amorality, and pure expression of life and the instincts which is extant in nature. Man must aspire to rid himself of sin, shame, guilt, repression, and self-hatred, and dare to venture beyond good and evil. Only then can man transform himself into a higher, healthier animal. The reanimalized man, the higher man, affirms life and exalts life despite suffering. He no longer labels death and suffering as evil, but embraces them as part of life. To summarize, we view Genesis 1 through 3 as a symbolic description of man's acquisition of higher consciousness and fall from the animal state, a tale of the first great transformation of mankind, a tale of how we became human. And this brings us to the evolutionary perspective. Jordan Peterson has covered this topic fairly extensively, but I wanted to briefly review how the story of Eden maps onto the evolutionary history of mankind. Our frontal cortex, which is in large part responsible for our greater cognitive abilities as compared with other animals, is where we process ideas of good and evil, right and wrong. It is also what allows us to inhibit our more ancient instincts and drives which stem from the amygdala, the so-called lizard brain. The development of our large frontal cortex is linked with our increased dependence on eyesight, which evolved in part to detect snakes and ripe fruit, or more simply, food and predators. Additionally, our small pelvises, which resulted from walking on our hind legs, is what makes childbirth much more dangerous and painful for humans as compared with chimps and other animals. It also makes sense evolutionarily that women are the origin of shame, since women make men self-conscious. Women drive the evolutionary arms race for intelligence. Women inspire men to compete, to build, to create, and to better our species. Just as nature transforms animals through natural selection and decides who is worthy to carry on the torch of life, women transform our species through sexual selection by choosing which men are worthy of reproducing. Thus, Eve is both the protagonist of Genesis and the catalyst of our fall. She is the first Prometheus, both a thief and a champion of knowledge, both a sinner and a savior. The story of Eden can also be interpreted as a description of our fall from the free and natural hunter-gatherer way of life and entry into agricultural society where men are doomed to till the earth and women are restricted to the domestic. Much of our suffering comes from not being able to accept our nature. This is Jung's idea of integrating the shadow. We are no longer evolved to our environments. We are like animals in a zoo, and thus we suffer from our own nature. Nietzsche describes the origin of this suffering in the genealogy of morals. The man who is forced into an oppressive narrowness and regularity of custom impatiently tore himself apart, persecuted himself, gnawed away at himself, grew upset, and did himself damage. With him was introduced the greatest and strangest illness, from which today human beings have not recovered. The suffering of man from his own nature, from himself, a consequence of the forcible separation from his animal past, a declaration of war against the old instincts on which his power, joy, and ability to inspire fear had been based. In agricultural society, and even more so in industrial society, we are no longer evolved to our environment as we were when we lived in a tribal, hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In order to take up the challenge of modernity and transform ourselves into something greater in an environment which is increasingly toxic and promotes illness and weakness, We must make peace with our own nature and come to love our nature. Only then can we aspire to new heights. Nietzsche writes, "You aspire to free heights. Your soul thirsts for the stars. But your wicked instincts, too, thirst for freedom. Your wild dogs want freedom. They bark with joy in their cellar when your spirit plans to open all prisons." We must uncage and forgive these wild dogs. They have too long been abused and been turned into savage, starving creatures by this abuse. Now we must reconcile ourselves with them. We must come to view our instincts and passions as fundamentally good, as nature's guides for us, as her very will, and harness their power for the act of creation. And finally, let us look at the symbolic meaning of Genesis 1 through 3. Snakes and trees are two of the most common symbolic motifs. This may be because we co-evolved with them and they are permanently impressed upon our biology. Snakes often appear as creatures of transformation, healing, knowledge, and self-transcendence. Those who adventure into greater speculation believe that the symbol of the two intertwined snakes may be an unconscious, instinctual representation of the structure of DNA. Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins recently had a debate about this subject. Peterson, of course, defending it, and Dawkins claiming that the idea is absolute rubbish. However, I do not find the idea that the most basic structures of life are revealed in religious symbolism to be far-fetched. The tree of life is another example of a mythological motif found in almost every religion and culture. The structure of a tree follows one of the most basic patterns of nature, the river fractal. The nervous systems of vertebrate organisms, the literal trees of life at the center of our bodies, are structured like this fractal. Look at our circulatory and respiratory systems. Look at the structure of rivers and plants. Now, look at a diagram representing evolution. As life moves from generation to generation, and thus conquers death, it is forming a fractal pattern across time. All of life forms a tree-shaped fractal. All of life is part of one tree of life, whose roots reach into the very depths of the earth and the divine. The will of life, the will of nature, the will of God are the sap of this tree, for they are all one will, and they flow through you. You are life's vessel to the next generation. To your DNA, you are like the skin of a snake, which is shed each generation as life transforms itself in the struggle against death and entropy. Your DNA holds the most ancient secret knowledge of life. Your DNA guards the tree of life. To conclude, Genesis can be understood as a description and symbolic representation of the first major event in the history of mankind, the first psychological and biological transformation of our species, the very dawn of human consciousness. By stealing knowledge from the divine, Eve fundamentally altered what it means to be human and created man as we know him. Eve is the mother of mankind, the author of our greatest woes, but also the giver of our greatest gift. From this story, we may take three essential principles. Our first principle, that suffering and death are not evil. Rather, acute awareness of them is the price we must pay for higher consciousness. This higher consciousness has introduced shame, guilt, resentment, and deceit into the world, and thereby separated us from nature and God. But this is where our second principle comes in, that our instincts are not evil. We can and should aspire to live in union with nature and God through the proper expression of the instincts and the will to life. By disciplining and harnessing our instincts, we can aspire towards that noble existence of the lion who embraces life with all of his being, without resentment and without shame. And our third principle, that all of life is part of one tree and one will. The tree of life is nature's will projected through time in its struggle against entropy. God is life. Our bodies are the vessels which bear that life from generation to generation, and in doing so, transform it. Our bodies are the temple of that life, and we are that life, that will to power, to thriving, to overcoming, that will to create, to transcend.